Now we arrive at the main topic of our video, medieval Christmas. Medieval Christmas was interesting in the fact that it was not just a few days. In the modern world we start to see the dreaded Christmas stock in the shops by September, but as Christmas Day approaches many of us still work and toil. So it's only really Christmas Eve, Christmas Day and Boxing Day which is fully celebrated. After the 26th, life slowly goes back to normal, with one last hurrah on New Year's Eve. But medieval Christmas was many days, 12 in fact, and in many ways the final day, 12th day, or the 6th of January, was most important of all. So let us journey through the 12 days of medieval Christmas, as well as the before and the after.
November the 11th, Martinmas. The first important day in the Christmas calendar of the Middle Ages was Martinmas, or St. Martin's Day. Martinmas marked the beginning of winter in the Middle Ages. This was a day where it was customary to slaughter any animals that had been designated for eating. This meat would have then been hung to either dry or smoked in the chimneys or smokehouses. The meat produced on this day would be commonly known as Martinmas meat. This was also a day for the common man to pay rents to their lord or to submit their tithes. If the tithe was of harvested crop, it would be stored in designated barns, a topic previously explored on this channel. As well as being a day for meat production and paying of fines and tithes, it was also a feast day, so people partook in some feasting. The feast day also came to be known as Beggars' Day, where children would go around dressed in rags asking for alms. This custom originates from the life of St. Martin himself. Having been a soldier in the 4th century CE, Martin was arrested for his Christian faith during a period where Rome was still pagan. The hagiography of St. Martin claims that while a soldier he chanced upon a beggar outside the walls of Amiens in the midst of winter. His faith led him to give this beggar half of his cloak for warmth. This act of kindness came to symbolise Martin. December the 6th, Feast of St. Nicholas. During this feast, a choir boy would be chosen as boy bishop. The boy bishop would then act as an adult priest all the way through to December the 28th, or Holy Innocents' Day. This is believed by some academics to be an affirmation of Christ's teaching of the special relationship between children and the kingdom of heaven. However, St. Nicholas is also known as the patron saint of children, and so the fact this custom was practiced on this feast day is no coincidence. Furthermore, there is a belief that the tradition may have derived from Saturnalia, especially with the facet of role reversal. The boy bishop would have taken all the services apart from Mass, and would even appoint canons from the choristers. If the boy bishop died in office, they would be buried with the honours of a full bishop. An example of this has been discovered at Salisbury Cathedral, where a statue was found depicting a boy dressed as a bishop. This tradition was practised all over Britain in almost every ecclesiastical house, though some of the more conservative within the church did not find it amusing, comparing it to the Feast of Fools and a mockery of traditional church ceremonies. It was definitely enjoyed by some royalty in the Middle Ages, with Edward I famously having the Vespers sung by the boy bishop, to which he rewarded them 40 shillings. By the Tudor period, this custom had dwindled due to the disapproval within the church and attempts by Henry VIII and Elizabeth to ban it. December 8th, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. As the name suggests, this celebrated the Immaculate Conception of the Blessed Virgin Mary, and its celebration dates back to the 11th century. December the 13th, St. Lucy's Day. St. Lucy's Day commemorates the Virgin Martyr St. Lucy, who was executed during Diocletian's persecutions of the Christians in 304 CE. She is usually depicted holding her gouged out eyes, which the hagiography details was performed before her execution. For as long as the Julian calendar was in use, this feast day aligned with the winter solstice, or the longest night of the year. For this reason, St. Lucy's Day is linked with pagan celebrations of light and the sun. During the Middle Ages, this day would have seen processions with candles. These candles would have also adorned headdresses made of greenery. In the Middle Ages, the celebration of this saint's day was most prolific in Scandinavia. December the 21st, St. Thomas's Day. This fell on a date we have already explored, the 21st of December, which our pagan ancestors would know as winter solstice. St. Thomas was a carpenter, and known for his generosity. Therefore, on this day, the old, infirm, and poor, as well as children, would go out collecting alms, which became known as Thomasing. Another tradition was to go a-corning, where there would be a gathering of corn or grains from houses. The recipients would then bestow a blessing or give a sprig of holly or mistletoe in thanks. Christmas Eve. Once again, we see another pagan tradition. On Christmas Eve, the men would go out into the wood or forest and would collect a large log. This was then colourfully decorated with ribbons and dragged back to the house. The log was then placed on the hearth and would be burnt continually for the 12 days of Christmas. Though this was a pagan tradition, its incorporation into the Christian tradition came to symbolise light and Jesus Christ, and the consequent defeat of sin. Another tradition of this evening in the Middle Ages was to bring in greenery from outside and decorate the interior of the house. This would have been in form of laurel, holly, and ivy. Unlike more modern superstitions, these decorations would stay up well after Christmas, lasting until Candlemas Eve, or February the 1st. Christmas Day in the Middle Ages was not too dissimilar to modern Christmas Day. In the Middle Ages, Christmas Day was the official end of Advent, and with this meant the end of fasting. Furthermore, many workers would stop their work, putting aside their ploughs and oxen, not to take them up until Plough Monday, the first plough day after Twelfth Night. Therefore, the 12 days of Christmas had truly begun. The crux of the day's celebration was to celebrate the coming of Jesus Christ, the Saviour of mankind. Before the dawn there would be the first of 3 masses, after which the congregation would head back to partake in a feast. Of course, this feast would have been different depending on your social standing. Wealthier households would have eaten expensive courses, with peacock and swan being the central serving. In more modest households, a goose, a chicken, or a capon would be served for the Christmas feast. The relative of the modern mince pie would have also been eaten in wealthy households. The Christmas pie. The pie would have included an array of meats, spices, and topped with fruit. The pie would have been lidded with a pastry, being made in the shape of an oval. In some instances, the small pastry baby Christ would adorn the pie lid. Nevertheless, around medieval England everyone would have feasted. As well as this, the Lord of Misrule would have been elected, who would then be in charge of the revelry for the 12 days of Christmas. As well, you would also see mummers' plays performed around the country. Ultimately, Christmas Day was a day for community and feasting. December the 26th, the Feast of St. Stephen, or Boxing Day. St. Stephen is known as the first Christian martyr, having been stoned to death for blasphemy, an event witnessed by Paul the Apostle. He is first recorded in the Acts of the Apostles as a deacon appointed to distribute food and charitable aid. During this time, Stephen also went around the local synagogues in North Africa preaching his beliefs. The eponymous stoning of Stephen occurred in Jerusalem, outside of either the northern or eastern gate. This day was usually a day known for hunting, where the wealthy would go out with their hounds and hunt a beast. It was also a day where horses and cattle were bled. December the 27th, the Feast of St. John the Evangelist. St. John the Evangelist was the believed author of the Gospel of John and the Book of Revelations. Moreover, in the Christian tradition he is identified as John the Apostle. John the Apostle was the youngest of the 12 apostles and is said to be the apostle that Jesus truly loved. The hagiography of John claims that while in Ephesus he consumed poison wine to demonstrate the power of his faith, but thanks to God's aid the poison was rendered harmless. This story led to the custom to use this day as a day for unfettered drinking. Bottles of wine or cider would have been brought to Mass and blessed. Thus, this day would have been steeped in drunkenness. December 28th, Childermas. Known also as Children's Mass or Holy Innocents' Day, this feast commemorated the slaying of the baby boys in Bethlehem ordered by King Herod after hearing the news of the birth of Jesus Christ. On this day, many people would have fasted. It was also customary in the Middle Ages for people to refrain from work on this feast day. Then, throughout the year until the next Childermas, the day of the week which the feast had fallen on would be named Innocents' Day and would have seen people refraining from work. Children were also given freedom on this day. For instance, they were allowed to play in the church. However, another custom saw children whipped to commemorate the killing of the innocents. Furthermore, this was also a day where the tenure of the boy bishop would have ended. December the 29th, the feast of St. Thomas Becket. Thomas Becket is arguably one of the most famous medieval saints. Thomas Becket was elected as Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162, but his death would come in 1170. Thomas and his relationship with the King of England, Henry II, had floundered since his election. In 1164, Thomas had given Henry II verbal acceptance of the constitutions of Clarendon. This constitution would have given the king revenue from vacant sees, forbade excommunication of royal officials, and the power of the king to influence episcopal elections. Thomas ended up revoking this request and appealed to the Pope. Relations between Thomas and Henry deteriorated, and when Thomas was summoned to the Council of Northampton in 1164, he fled to France after being warned by other bishops that he faced imprisonment. Thomas lived in exile in France until December 2nd, 1170. Attempts were made for reconciliation, but these came to naught, and the king and Thomas persisted in their hatred of each other. In 1169, Henry II had added an addition to the constitutions of Clarendon, which withdrew England from papal obedience, and by 1170 Henry had his eldest son crowned as co-ruler by the Archbishop of York. As this was a breach of papal prohibition and the right of only Canterbury to crown a king, Thomas excommunicated every person involved in the coronation. Henry, fearing papal repercussion for England, allowed the return of Thomas to Canterbury, returning on December 2nd. On his return, Thomas refused to lift excommunication of certain bishops and even enact new excommunications. Following this, Henry supposedly uttered the words, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" Though the veracity of these words has been debated by many academics. Nevertheless, these uttered words were taken as a command by 4 knights of Henry, and so on the 29th of December 1170, 4 knights arrived and entered Canterbury Cathedral, and after a heated argument, slew Thomas Becket. Thomas was canonised on the 21st of February 1173, and in 1174 Henry II performed public penance at the tomb of Thomas Becket. A fire in the same year destroyed much of Canterbury Cathedral, but from the embers a new chapel for Thomas was built. But it was not until 1220 that the translation of Thomas Becket occurred, and his cult would remain housed in Trinity Chapel until 1538. Thomas's cult was definitely one of the most important cults in medieval England. Throughout the Middle Ages, the shrine of Thomas Becket was one of the most visited in all of England. Pilgrims would have come from all over Europe to visit the site of the death of this most venerable of saints. Many examples of pilgrim badges depicting Thomas Becket have been discovered, leading credence to its extreme popularity in the Middle Ages. Thus far, we have explored the most important days of December in medieval England. However, the festivities did not stop there. They continued well into the new year. One must remember that the new year actually began on Lady Day, which is the 25th of March. So New Year in the Middle Ages was not actually New Year. Instead, we see a custom pop up from Saturnalia, which is that of gift giving, though there is also the belief that this originated from the Druidic custom of gift giving. During this gift giving, many of the rich and wealthy in medieval England would have given elaborate gifts. Here are some examples. For instance, Henry III was criticised during his reign for extorting New Year's gifts from his subjects. In 1286, Edward I gifted his wife Eleanor of Castile a gold pitcher decorated in enamel and precious stones. In 1209, Eleanor of Castile purchased 72 paternoses as gifts. In 1407, Richard Mitford, Bishop of Salisbury, gave gifts to the pages of his household, as well as buying 72 rings and 2 brooches as New Year's gifts. And Henry VI gave gifts to his families. These included things such as tablets of gold studded with jewels. Twelfth Night, the 5th of January. One can argue that Twelfth Night was one of the most important days of the medieval Christmas calendar. Though much of Twelfth Night celebrations had a Christian flavour, one cannot deny that Twelfth Night was steeped in pagan customs. The act of wassailing, which originates in the Anglo-Saxon past, was a popular custom which was practised on this evening, whereby locals would go house to house with special ale or cider. This ale or cider would then be traded for gifts, alms, or the receiver's own wassail. During this trade the words "Veus Heil" would be shouted, meaning "be in good health" in Old English. In many areas the locals would take their revelry to the local orchards to bless the trees. This revelry would be accompanied with songs and carols meant to scare off the evil spirits, as well as bless the trees. Feasting was also an important facet of Twelfth Night, and would be accompanied with mummers' plays, whereby people wearing disguises, usually in the form of masks made to look like animal heads, would perform dances and act out special plays. This was an important night for many of the peasantry as well. On this night, the peasants would go out into the fields and perform a ritual meant to improve fertility of the land. They would find the highest spot in the field and light 12 small fires with one large bonfire. This was accompanied with blessing the fields with wassail. Though this tradition is believed to be rooted in the pagan past, the fires came to signify Christ and the 12 apostles. An even smaller fire was placed away from the grouped fires to signify Judas. After this fire ritual was completed, another ritual commenced. This time a 12th night cake, which had been baked in the peasant household, was taken to where the oxen presided. This cake had been purposely baked with a hole in the centre. The circular cake was then placed on the horns of the best oxen. The peasants would look on as the oxen attempted to shake off the cake. When the cake had finally been shaken off by the oxen, the peasants would see where it had landed. If it was behind, it was called an istress, and given to the wife of the oxen's owner, and if in front, it was called a boosie, and given to the owner. This ceremony was therefore practised to protect against bad luck and ensure the fertility of the ox for the coming year. Ultimately, Twelfth Night was a night of both revelry and superstition. Epiphany. Epiphany fell on January the 6th and was the end of the 12 days of Christmas and a time to take down the greenery which had adorned the interior of people's houses. Another name for Epiphany was Twelfth Day, with Twelfth Night having occurred the night before. Epiphany was a festival to celebrate the coming of the Magi to the crib in which Jesus lay. In early Christianity, Epiphany was combined with the Nativity, but by the Middle Ages it was a separate festival. On this day, a play was performed known as the Feast of the Star. During this play, chosen priests would dress up as the three kings and enter the church bearing gifts, at which point a star would be hoisted aloft, meant to symbolise the Star of Bethlehem, and the priests would proceed down the aisle towards a crib. The priests would then present their gifts to a child chosen from the local community who had been placed in a crib to symbolise the baby Christ. For many, this festival was the terminus of the Christmas festivities. But was it? Plough Monday. Plough Monday would have fallen on the first Monday after Twelfth Day. This was a day when life returned to the realms of normality, though on this day there were still festivities to be had. One custom which popped up in the Middle Ages was running the plough. Documents from the 15th century record ploughs being dragged through the streets while money was collected for a parish fund. This money would have been spent on plough lights, which were candles lit in the parish church meant to bestow the Lord's blessing on those who worked the fields. The custom of plough lights ended due to the Reformation, but the running of the plough survives even today in some parts of the British Isles. Our final Christmas celebration comes a month after Epiphany and is known as Candlemas. Candlemas took place on the 2nd of February and was seen by many in the Middle Ages as the true end of Christmas. The festival celebrated the purification of the Virgin Mary after the birth of Jesus Christ, as well as the presentation of Jesus in the temple. The name Candlemas comes from the custom of lighting many candles to represent the light of Jesus. It was a festival of light and was the ultimate conclusion to nearly 2 months of festivities.